We are very, very fortunate today to have Dr. Stephanie Y. Evans, who is one of the editors of a new book called Dear Department Chair, Letters from Black Women Leaders to the Next Generation. Thank you so much, Dr. Stephanie Evans, for holding that up. It's published by Wayne State University Press, out September the 5th. And again, very, very fortunate to have you with us. Let me just tell our audience that Dr. Evans is a full professor at the Institute for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Georgia State University. And she served for 12 consecutive years, that's really important, as the department chair from 2010 to 2022. So welcome so much, Dr. Evans. Good to see you.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So as a new school year begins, this book really could not come at the right time. I mean, it's so really important. And I had the chance to read it last week, and just so many wonderful gems that you all offer. So tell me a little bit about how this all came to be, and also a little bit about the co-editors who've worked on this project with you.
Yes. Well, this book is an outgrowth of my experience as a department chair, as you mentioned, 12 consecutive years at 3 different institutions. And so I wrote this book because I'm a writer. And so whatever my experience is in higher education or my research in intellectual history, it starts and ends with the fact that we must write, we must keep a record of our own personal experiences, but also to give context to those experiences. So after stepping down from the chair, I was chair at University of Florida, at Clark Atlanta University, and at Georgia State University. I started thinking about my experience and how to make meaning of that experience. And the one thing that stood out to me was the stress level of being a department chair. There are so many tasks and responsibilities. And I started just jotting down, and the list got longer and longer and longer. And I just started thinking like, okay, so given that we know this is the extensive job description, that you have accountability in all corners of the campus, you have so many areas of, so many tasks that you have to do, leadership and management. And then there are things like COVID that happens, right? To just blow everything up. So I started thinking about not only the job description and my stress level, but how did I manage that? And it really was my network. It really was my reaching out to Tracy T. Deneen Sharpley Whiting at Vanderbilt University when I was at Clark Atlanta. And I said, I'm having these issues and I'm an experienced chair. How can we start to develop a peer mentoring network so we can all lean on each other? And out of that network came a relationship with 2 Stephanies. So Stephanie Adams is an engineer at UT Dallas, and Stephanie Shonekan is in the arts, a dean of arts now at University of Maryland. And so through these meetings, we just started having this conversation, and we say, oh yeah, we should, the Stephanies need to get together and write this book. And it was a joke at first, but it really was my understanding that the only reason why I not only survived being a department chair, but continued to write and be able to write was because of this network. So we started thinking about what we wanted to say and pull together our combined wisdom, our combined experience, our combined knowledge, and write. And I chose the epistolary form, the epistles, the letters to the next generation, so that it was more personal. And as Dr. Sharpley Whiting intimated in her final comments, this is an intimate book. It's a small, little, beautiful book of letters to the next generation of leaders, because we've got so much work to do, but it's really a challenging job. And so, of course, these are letters of, kind of all of the wisdom that we wish we had had, but also an encouragement for people to form their own networks.
Yeah, and I love the fact that they're in letter form, right? Because again, when I think back to like series like Letters to a Young Journalist or Letters to a Young Doctor or whatever, it is really like yourself kind of looking back and giving advice, perhaps advice that you wish you had, right? To, as you point out, to the next generation. So it's really nice. I'm curious to know, was department chair always within the cards for you? I mean, when you were a PhD student, and we both did our PhDs at UMass Amherst. So shout out to the Du Bois Department of Afro American Studies. But did you think like I want to do administration at some point, or were you like set on just doing research and being a faculty member? And what drew you to that work?
Well, I was completely surprised and taken unawares. Yes, and so shout out to the Du Bois Department of Afro American Studies, where Esther Terry and John Bracey really laid the groundwork for me understanding what a department chair was. As an undergraduate, I thought what everybody else thought. The department chair is the complaints department. As a graduate student, the department chair is kind of the welcoming committee. I wasn't, my research was Black women's intellectual history, right? Fannie Jackson Coppin, Mary Cloud Bethune, Septima Clark, and these leaders were who I studied for my dissertation, but it really didn't occur to me until I took the role of department chair. And that was just kind of a natural ascension after getting tenure in my small department in Afro-American Studies, that I realized I was actually studying not only educators, but administrators. And so when I wrote Black Women in the Ivory Tower, it took me 10 years to write, and I studied all of that. And I thought I was just studying educational history, but it actually turned out to be a manual of how to do these things. And again, I credit my network, but also an understanding of the institutional history of the different types of institutions that I found myself in, where I could go back to those leaders and say, oh, okay, Bethune did this, or Fannie Coppin did that, Septima Clark did this. And so I had an understanding of what my role was. And then the living examples of the Du Bois Department really helped me understand it's a service position. It's not something that you get for clout. And even if you think that you're going to be in power, when you get in this position, as soon as you're in power, you understand it's, the Chronicle had a Chronicle of Higher Education had a discussion of leading from the middle, and how you really are, you've got all of the accountability and none of the power. And so these things helped me understand what the role was about, and my network and the history helped me navigate it.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that it's really a service kind of role, right? I mean, it really is of service if you think about it from that aspect, which I think is really, really important to do. Let's talk about some of the tips or things that you offer, I think, for readers, because as I was reading along, I mean, some of the things that caught my attention was, one, you write a lot, or you and your co-editors talk a lot about self-care and compassion. So talk a little bit about that, why that's important.
There's so much good advice. Of course, Johnetta Cole wrote the foreword, and her 7 tips from her experience at all levels of administration, at all different types of institutions, really helps us understand that we need to be prepared. Colette Taylor, who's a longtime friend of mine from Seattle, talks about leading with humility. Adams talks about focus. Shonekan talks about keep your head up and form a sisterhood, and how to not just power through it, but to really understand that you have others to lean on, right? And this network. And frankly, I moved from intellectual history to mental health because the job was so stressful. So the advice really to take care of yourself and to really focus on self-care is not kind of, woo-woo self-care, like, oh, let me get a bath and a massage and things like that. No, it's a survival technique. It's a survival strategy. If you do not take care of yourself, take care of your mental health, manage your time, manage your emails, do those types of things to pull in to the center of gravity, to breathe, which is why I started studying yoga and mental health in narratives, is because the job was so stressful. I had to find out a different way to occupy my mind, right? To live this life of the mind in a way that didn't continue to build on my stress. So the self-care is not, and because this is a care-taking task, right? You are taking care of human beings in a unit. If you don't take care of yourself, there's no way that you can have any sort of clarity to be a leader, right? And to understand that you have to respect the autonomy of others. That if you're going to say no and you're going to set boundaries, you also have to accept that other people are going to say no, and you have to have certain types of understandings of what it means to be a human being in this position. And especially during COVID, we saw people all over the place, right? And where your priorities are, where institutional values are. And so I pulled into my Rosalind Terborg Penn, the co-founder of Association of Black Women Historians, talked about African women's values of survival and self-care, but also communal care. So I let that be my guide during these, because I was a chair during COVID, and it was horrific. So, really finding out how to care about yourself, but understanding that must extend to the people who you're caring for.
No, that's so important. And I think I learned from you that Rosa Parks did yoga, right? I mean, which I did not know at all, which is fascinating to me. It's like how even as you're involved in kind of these mass protests and movements or these really tough jobs, that you have to find ways to kind of center yourself, which I think is really, really important. So, yeah. The second one was do not be a boss. And I love this because I think there was I think there was a reference to Toni Morrison and her quote as well, which is, I think if you have to see yourself as bigger than other people, then that's a problem, right? You almost become small. So talk about that whole concept of do not be a boss, because I think sometimes people see these roles as being chairs or even being deans or whatever as power, right? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And I want to read from here because it was almost infuriating to me to see how people wield power. And you have to have accountability, and you're going to make mistakes. And I certainly have made many. But at some point, you have to understand that this is a responsibility. And again, COVID showed us what was happening, and the racial uprisings and what's happening now in higher education, the decisions that people are making, that it's not about being the boss. So I write, do not be a boss. Boss mentality is oppressive and predatory. Respect and support work and workers, including unions. Be kind to others. They don't owe you or the institution their life. Do not be a boss. Folks will have different work ethics, habits, motivations, and experiences. Focus on the task at hand, not trying to control other human beings. Toni Morrison said, if you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And I go on. And basically, it's really just understanding that this is work. It's very hard work. And yes, it's your job, but you are working with other people. Like I have a supervisor, I've never had a boss. You're not the boss of me. And if that's how I feel, then I have no right to act like I'm the boss. I am a supervisor. And, if you're not doing your work, then that has to be addressed. But this idea of I'm your boss and I can tell you what to do and therefore I own you, really, the institution should not be run like a plantation.
Yeah. And I think it requires the academy, higher education in general, to shift our focus, right, in terms of how we think about these positions and roles, right? So then the other was, I love this one, don't seek to be the only one or the main one. Because, one of the things that I'm always fascinated when I hear people say, I've been the only one for the last 25 years. And I'm thinking, but that's the problem. You're the part of the problem, right? Because if we're lifting as we climb, shouldn't we be bringing other people behind us?
And that was kind of the aha moment when Stephanie and I were sitting around. It's like, okay, my name is Stephanie and I'm a Black woman in academia, and I'm an exemplar, like whatever. Okay, but so are these other Stephanies, and there's actually 3 Stephanies because Stephanie Williams, Stephanie Shonekan knew Stephanie Williams. So we chose to submit the book to Wayne State University Press because she's the first Black woman director of a university press. And so when we're talking about leadership, we're talking about leadership definitely at the hub of the university, which is the department chair. But this book also has, it's kind of has the stamp of another outstanding, excellent Stephanie, as well as a board chair, Eunice Jeffries in Michigan. And so we have to think leadership at all up and down the university system. And the purpose is not to just be representative, right? To be the identity, like it's not just about diversity of identity. There's a wonderful book called Elite Capture, which really talks about how there are certain people who get in the room and stay in the room and like to be the only one in the room. And so with the Stephanies, it's like, no, there's plenty of room for everybody, which means you need to bust down all the doors and the walls and move the chair outside of the room. And, as Eunice Jeffers says, pull the table to your chair. There's folding chairs. There's all sorts of chairs now that we know about, right? And all sorts of ways to use chairs. But we absolutely have to understand that it's not about you.
Yeah.
Like I'm special, but I'm not that special.
Yeah. No. Well said. Well said. And how do we make room for others to be at that table? Which gets me to my next question, which is that we read a lot about the sort of mass exodus of particularly people of color from higher ed. We've written about it at Diverse Issues quite extensively. And I was wondering, are you concerned about whether or not we are in fact preparing this next generation to take on these roles?
There's so much work to be done. And at the same time, I understand why people leave, right? For me, myself, and I personally, I refuse to cede the ground of higher education because it's what I love. And so, but at the same time, I can't blame people for leaving because there's so much abuse in higher education, abuse of power, abuse of principle, all sorts of interpersonal abuse. And so, if you're in an abusive situation, you should absolutely leave when and how you can. At the same time, I understand that I can endure certain things and must endure certain things because those who came before me did so. So I take it as a responsibility that if I'm going to say I'm an academic, I'm an intellectual, and I'm going to do this work, it is absolutely my responsibility to do for others what was done for me. All the letters of recommendation, all the review sessions, the tenure and promotion review, all of that invisible service. And definitely at the same time, though, I want a different, I don't want to just endure, right? Like Bettina Love says, we don't need to just survive, right? And so we're tasked at the same time of surviving the institution, of changing the institution. That's a big order. And so that's where, books like Rest is Resistance come in handy, because you have to understand the balance that we actually have a lot of work to do, and especially when we're, under attack. But again, the 10 years that I spent researching my first book, it was like, none of this actually surprises me. And that, I think, is a strength, that I don't take it personally, that I do Black women studies, and we're in a time where they're trying to outlaw again Black women studies. And so it's hard. It's hard. That's why I studied self-care. That's why I do all the self-care things, because it is very hard work. I understand why there's an exodus. I also understand that, again, going back to the need for network, as Shonekan says, unbow your head. We got work to do.
Yeah. And it strikes me that mentorship and sponsorship is so critically important as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And in terms of how do you, and again, my books like this, which is that you're helping individuals navigate this space. So they don't have to be alone or go through this by themselves, which I think is really important, that there's this network system.
Yeah. And develop your own network. This is not about one person who's deemed the leader of all people, right? This is about encouragement. There's so much good information and so many different experiences. Like Janetta Cole says, just because you've seen one Black woman doesn't mean that you've seen us all. We are very different. And some Black women are very capable of causing harm. So we have to address that, again, with accountability. But these are, Black feminist groundings of leadership, Black feminist understandings of how you lead. And it really is a collaborative model of leadership that doesn't have to do with this is the way that this one person said. It's like, no, these are principles that may help you. Use what you can, leave the rest, and develop your own networks. Here's how we did it.
Yeah. You mentioned Dr. Cole, and of course, so many of us love Dr. Cole, and we've followed her career, and she has certainly been a guiding light for so many of us. I was wondering why was it important for you all to include her voice, given her significant history and work in this space?
It was really about well, two things: leadership and leaning on that network. Stephanie Adams is a direct mentee. Now, I've been kind of on the periphery of the circles of the universes of Dr. Cole for some time, but I didn't have any personal connection. But she's mentored so many people, and so Stephanie Adams reached out and beg the favor. But for me, it was really an understanding that she's been a university president twice, right? In addition to all of her other leadership in areas up and down higher education.
And outside, National
Right,
Council of
right.
Negro Women.
Absolutely, absolutely. I was just getting there, and it's like understanding the breadth of what leaders, and still active, and still she just wrote something for ASALH, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, whose theme this year is resistance, right? And so education and Black history as resistance. She's been about it, and her understanding of what it means to lead different institutions and to be a leader and be part of a leadership network was really invaluable, and that showed in her comments.
Yeah, and I would also just say she's just super nice. I mean, is a really genuinely nice person. When I think of Dr. Cole, I think of other really towering leaders like Freeman Rabowski and others who really just are really about pouring into the next generation and really helping in whatever way they can. And there are so many individuals like this, but Dr. Julianne Malveaux, there are others as well. And again, just want to really also just give a shout out and appreciate that kind of service, because that's really, really important. I was in a conversation recently with a dean who had told me that, in his opinion, a chair really should only be held by someone who is a full professor, given the hierarchy sometimes that exists within the academy. And I know you're a full professor. I was just curious, do you have any thoughts about that? Whether or not the chair role really should be reserved for someone who's in a full professorship.
If only National Center for Education Statistics says that there's 2% of Black women who are full professors. This many percent, right? If that's the criteria, then that means that we will be, in effect, excluded from leadership positions. And because the department chair is the pipeline, or should be the pipeline, to other leadership roles, to deans, to provosts, to presidents. And so I think it's a delicate balance. To say that only full professors should lead a department is problematic because of the diversity issue. I also understand that there are tasks, and I experience this myself as an associate professor, being the head of a unit where you cannot evaluate your colleagues. So I understand the kind of sticky situation. But I also understand that there's this book will invite a lot of conversations about leadership. For me, I think the department chair is such a critical role because it's the forward-facing position on campus that's accountable to everyone. And if you haven't been a department chair, can you really understand what it means to be a dean? Can you really understand what it means to be a provost or a president? And, because you are held accountable and responsible for enacting all of the policies that the higher ups make. And so I definitely understand the rationale behind the full professor stance, but I also understand that if you wait until, and there are a lot of full professors who really should not sit in the chair. They really should not, simply because there's there's so many skills that are required in terms of communication, accountability, consistency, transparency, that not all full professors have demonstrated that they're capable of.
Or have that service passion that you talked about earlier, which I think is so critically important for that role, right?
Yeah, they'll sit in the chair,
Yeah.
and then everybody else will be doing the work.
Absolutely. Do you miss the, I mean, I know you've been out now for a year from this role, but I'm curious, do you miss it?
No, no, no,
12 years is a long time, right?
no, I don't miss it at all.
Okay.
That being said, would I do it again the exact same way? Yes, I would, which is weird. But I think you can read things in books, and I write books, I love books, but books only go so far. Zora Neale Hurston said, you got to go there to know there. And sitting in the chair at 3 very different institutions under different circumstances really helped me understand higher education in a way that I would never have been able to understand. Like, there's just so many silent battles that the chair is forced to, wage or defend or fall on swords, or, all of the metaphors. It's such a difficult, it really made me humble in a way, and filled with gratitude. When I handed off and there were lots of dynamics and circumstances. So I stepped down a semester early. I had already let everyone know that this was my last year, but there were changing dynamics in the department. When I handed the baton to the person who's sitting in the chair now, I was ever grateful. I was available. I was, supportive in any way. So once you've done the job, I think for me, it made me a little bit more aware of how challenging it is. So I make sure that I'm responsive, that I'm, active, in a way that, if you, it's like, well, that's your job. You're just supposed to do that. And you don't really know all that's entailed, which is why I think it's really important to have a succession plan and to allow for other people in the department to experience leadership positions, so you have an appreciation for what it takes.
Yeah, that's well said for sure. When I think about this book, and again, I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for giving this gift to all of us. Um, I started thinking that this would be really wonderful reading for a leadership program, or just students who are interested in higher ed in general. And I hope some of our listeners and viewers will think about adding this to their reading list, because I think it really is important, particularly that we center the voices of Black women, which I also think is very, very important. A lot of books about chairs and leadership is also not written from that perspective, and I think that's really important. So I would just ask, would you agree that this could in fact be useful for doctoral students, or even master's students in graduate programs, or even undergrad, quite frankly?
Absolutely. This is a very accessible book because it is written in the letter as essay form. So anyone in higher education leadership, whether that's the higher education leadership program, anyone enrolled in education classes, anyone currently in the chair, deans, associate deans, directors. I think all board members of universities should read this, and presidents all the way down, because it really helps us have a markedly different understanding of what it means to lead, what models are currently in place, what those models are missing, how those models are causing harm. So anyone in higher education needs to read this book. There's also a case to be made for anyone in the professions. This is a book about leadership. So whether it's leadership in the medical professions, it definitely in business and social work and policy, in STEM fields, anyone that's discussing leadership really needs to understand, how do we look at different models of leadership in ways that, again, center one's cultural values and cultural values of care, cultural values of, working in ways that don't dehumanize people. I think English departments would be interested in this because it's a case study in letter writing, right? A case study in form. And recently, I was in Washington, D.C. State University Press was part of this independent booksellers market, where I got to discuss this book with, and people who own bookstores. And so even there were some bookstores that were higher ed adjacent, but there are a lot of independent bookstores. This was East Coast, of people who own bookstores who, are really are part of this discussion about what should be read, what books should be banned. And so I had a bunch of wonderful discussions with indie booksellers. So this, I think, will be a far-reaching book.
No, absolutely. And thank you so much for giving this to us along with your co-editors, and certainly want to, again, invite all of our readers and listeners to go get your copy of Dear Department Chair, Letters from Black Women Leaders to the Next Generation. It's right there. And again, published by Wayne State University Press, and it's been out since September 5th. So final question for you, and that is, you talked a little bit about what you hope individuals will get from this book, but anything else you want to add before we depart?
I'll just say, I'm grateful for the work that you do. You have been on the grind for quite some time. And I think my focus is intellectual history, but it's applied intellectual history. So this is really, I know there's so many problems with guides and how-to guides and things like that, but I think about where I would be if people didn't write before. And so I'm grateful that my colleagues have enabled me to continue. I get the question about productivity a lot, like, how do you write so much? And it really is because I surround myself with people who have the same values and who are interested in helping others, but not at the expense of helping themselves, right? And so we can collectively lean on each other, and it makes the work it makes the work not only bearable, but something that that gives us life. Language matters. And so we're always saying, oh, you killed that, I don't want to kill nothing, I want to make it live. Right. So I appreciate the work that you do with, in diverse issues that helps create space for people to write and connect and network and do the work in a way that we're not doing it alone, because you really do. You've done a lot of work, and I really appreciate it.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much for that. And I should tell our audience that when Dr. Evans was really just a junior faculty member many, many years ago, we had her as one of our emerging scholars. And I'm taking this way back. but I'll tell you, we were so really happy that she was one of our emerging scholars. And of course, at that time, she had already emerged in some ways, in many ways, but we were really so proud of the work that you've done. And the work particularly around Black women, which I think is really, really important, and why we need to spend more time talking about and cultivating more leaders who are Black women as well. So thank you so much. This is great. Thank you for your time, your commitment, and all that you do. So thank you.
All right. Thank you.